Hey, it's Drybear, and today we're going to talk about a very important topic, and that is how to maximize your damage in Diablo 4. Because as you push towards Nightmare and Torment, and eventually your Nightmare dungeons all the way up to 100, you're going to want to have a heavily optimized build that not only has synergies in it, but also has excellent scaling values for the raw numbers so that you go to the moon. So today I'm going to teach you how to, with very simple steps and small changes and a little bit of wisdom, make your damage scale infinitely higher than it was before. But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come hang out with me and the community, you're going to get your shoes on tomorrow, and as you start to move, one of your socks is going to slip down under your heel. All right, let's get started on how to understand increasing your damage values. Just to make sure I grab the lowest common denominator so we're all on the same page. For anyone who doesn't have a lot of time thinking about damage scalars and multiplicative versus additive, let's make a very simple example that everyone can understand so we're all kind of caught up, and then we'll go into the idea of what's been discussed, damage buckets or clusters of damage, additive versus multiplicative, and why it's so dang important to be aware of the types of damage so you can maximize your damage output. So we'll start the example with a very basic number. Say you deal damage with a core ability that does 100 damage exactly. So you deal 100 damage to a target, you have no armor on, no bonuses, nothing, you just have your weapon, you struck the target with a weapon or some core ability that did 100 damage. And you're looking to increase that. Obviously, you want to do more damage, bigger numbers, you want to clear more content. So what you do is you find a piece of gear that actually has on it percent increase to damage. So say the item that you equip has this plus 10% chance or plus 10% scalar to damage, right? And then you find another item that has plus 10% scalar to damage. And you actually find it so that all of your items have plus 10% scalar to damage. There's a very important distinction here between how this calculation is managed, right? If this is multiplicative, then what you would do in the first case is you would take the 100 and then you would scale it by 10%, get the new number, scale that new number by 10%, get the new number, and scale that new number by 10%, get the new number. Meaning it's cumulative and multiplicative. You're getting that scaling value as you go along, right? So you have one situation where you would end up with 100 and let's say 133.1 or something like that damage. And if these add all together and they get applied as a sum of percent scalars, which would be 30% off 100, you do 130 damage. So the calculation difference here makes a difference in damage output. And this can get very seriously out of control, right? So if you had this and you get to 130 and then you get a 100% damage scalar, adding 100% to this versus scaling it by 100% starts to really increase. This difference that exists between the two numbers gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so your biggest value gains in damage output come when you can multiply your damage output by a number, by a scalar, rather than adding more of the scalar you already have. Now, a group of content creators under the name Goblin Inc. did some really interesting testing over the server slam and the previous tests using thorns, which is a fixed value of damage output. You take damage, you return a flat value based on your thorns value, and they tested this and they found out that not all damage scalars are created equal. Some of them get clumped together in a bucket or a cluster of scalars. They get added together first and then they get applied, which means that on average, it would be a lower gain in value for damage than if they had been multiplied together. So what you get out of this, now that we're aware that calculating versus multiplicative versus additive changes the result and gives us more damage versus less, there is something to be known about what ones are additive and what ones are multiplicative. And it turns out that in game, there's actually a very easy way to see this. And unless there's bugs on launch, it might actually just work this way. But in game, you'll see next to the damage increase, either a plus sign or you'll see an X, and that tells you whether it's going to add to your damage or whether it's going to multiply to your damage. So you want to be very careful about this and learn which ones are going to be the most valuable or not. But let's talk about how these are clustered together. I don't think it's 100% on if this is exactly how it works or there's going to be any surprises when we finally get the game. But I think it's worth knowing what these are. So I'm going to go through the different categories of damage, talk about which ones are the most important, and then at the end, I'll just give you a general wisdom to use when you're making your build so you understand how to make your damage better. So as far as we know, with the very latest information and testing, these are the categories for damage. The first category is your main stat. So this is going to be like your int, your like intelligence. It's going to be strength. Depending on what class you are, you know that whatever your main stat is, it gives you a % scaling to all of your skill damage based on how much you have. So let's take an extreme example, and that you got no other forms of damage. Every single piece of gear, every gem, every Paragon board piece, everything that you have to make your character stronger is all your main stat, right? So if it's 0.1% or 1% more skill damage for every certain amount of main stat, and all you had was more main stat, you're gonna get to a point where adding 50 or 100 more main stat is gonna add an additive amount to your damage, right? Say you have 1,000 intelligence and you're a Necromancer or a Sorceress, and you add, so you're 1,000 int here, and you want to either add 100 more int, or you want to use a different category. So maybe you want to add 100% critical strike damage. In this case, the critical strike damage is going to add significantly more damage to you overall than getting more int, because you already have so much int. Adding more is just going to add it, whereas getting a different category of damage is going to scale it and make that number bigger. So that's actually the second category, which is criticals. Critical strikes are their own category. You have critical strike chance, critical strike damage scaling, and then some classes have very specific critical strike effects, like critical strike with core skills, critical strike with shape-shifting skills, critical strike with lightning skills, whatever it is. So you have that extra category. So you want to be able to fill that category as efficiently as you can, but you're going to get to a point based on how much available gear you have where there are going to be some diminishing values in continuing to add to critical. So you want to add to the next category to get you that multiplicative value between categories. So in this case, the next category, as far as I can tell, is all contextual damage. And what I mean by this is damage with, damage versus, damage when, damage while. All of these that are very specific. So damage to a target that is stunned, damage to a target that is slowed, damage to a target that is immobilized, damage to a target while you're healthy, damage to a target while you're injured. All of these very specific contextual damage numbers are, as far as we can tell as of today, in the same category, which means it's going to add all of those values together. And once it's done adding them together, then it's going to multiply that value to get your final number. This is why you want to be very careful about doing a lot of contextual damage, right? So if you do, well, think about it this way, right? If you have 100% damage to targets that are stunned, unlike the critical strike category or the main stat category, which is all the time, you're not going to be hitting a target that's stunned 100% of the time. It's very specific to that moment. And then say you slow them and you stun them and you have another 100% that goes off of that. This isn't going to be another 1,000% or another 10,000% damage. It's going to be 200% because they're going to add together. Whereas if you had another category over here, which was 100%, that would give you significantly more. It's a difference of 200% damage versus 10,000% damage because you multiplied. So when you're building your build, you want to have a good amount of main stat. We know that. We want to have a good amount of critical strike for the build itself. And we want some contextual damage that works for our build. You know, damage while, damage verse, any kind of CC, whatever it is. If it makes sense for your build or you can get it in your Paragon easily, you want to get these. But you don't want to overly invest in contextual, because I would argue that contextual is the weakest of all these damage categories. So that one is going to be all added together, and it's not even full uptime because most of these are contextual. And if you're outside the context of that damage scaler, you're not going to get the benefit. So it's not as good. The last category, by far, is the strongest category. And if it continues to work this way, it will actually make this category of damage 100% required in any build that you build for endgame, because again, it's in its own category, it's separate, it's accessible to everyone, and it's a multiplicative scalar to all damage that you deal. The last category that we are aware of as a community is vulnerable, which means that if you got damage while versus stun target, and damage while healthy, and damage while the target is slowed, and damage while the target is immobilized. So you got all of those on your gear, you put all those together, you're gonna get 400% scaling on that damage. If you added 50% vulnerable, you would still get a multiplicative scalar on all the values. So if you added that much with this just through vulnerable, you would get a much bigger return on your value because you ended up adding a separate category. So there's pros and cons to this. I think we already talked about at length the value of having a lucky strike or a lucky hit chance. It means that they can separate the vessel that delivers the damage for procs so that they can make procs a little more fair, and then that procs can be available to more builds. Same thing goes for overpower. The theory behind overpower is so that you can build tanky and still deal damage, which opens up more opportunities for building. And having these categories that have these hard lines and walls between them means that you don't just pick the best one and scale that into infinity, because you're going to get diminishing returns on that. There's only so many slots you can add that stat onto. There's limits on how much you can get. And as you're adding more and more and more, you start to get more value by adding a brand new category that you have less of or none of that will increase your damage significantly. So that's what we're learning from this, is that you really need to have a better idea of what these categories are. And the takeaway is that main stat is huge. You want to make sure you're always getting that. All percent damage seems to be its own category as well, though I'm not positive that that is actually the case and is going to stay that way. So this could be all percent damage. This could just be a sum of your contextual damage put together into a single number. But the idea here is that there's these categories and you want to make sure you have them. The lesson, the takeaway is that you need vulnerable. It is a standalone category all by itself that gives a scaling multiplicative number to all of your damage. You need vulnerable. Vulnerable is just ridiculously valuable. Critical strikes are also valuable. Not all builds have access to these or can use them to their fullest extent. And then you have your main stat scalar. Outside of that, once you've figured those out, then you want to kind of stack up as much of your all percent and your contextual damage as you can, but you want to make sure that if you're missing these critical and vulnerable categories, that's where the most damage is going to come from. So when you're making leveling builds, when you're developing new builds, you will want to make sure that they have vulnerable and some usage for critical if they can, and it makes sense to get the most value out. And once you've done that as your foundation for the build, then you start looking at contextuals and all percent to give you the rest. Now, if you're looking for builds, I've made over 50 of them at this point. There's going to be, I'm going to have to update all of these as we get more into the game and start clearing Nightmare and getting towards endgame. And so we're going to be focusing on that and getting that going. But if you want access to these are all free. You just have to join the Discord linked in the description. I have a D4 builds channel that you can look into. It has all the builds for the classes that I've made so far, as well as some optimized leveling builds that I've been posting on the build sheet that you can use for reference. So join up on the Discord if that's something that you're interested in. And that is the idea of damage buckets. It just allows them to group together similar types of damage to make stacking them less viable and make more damage types more viable and more valuable. And it gives them more knobs and levers to tune when they're trying to balance the game, so that, you know, it's not just damage while stunned is the best in the world and everyone stacks that and then you just get one stun on the target, or you stagger the boss and then everyone just goes ham and one shots them inside that window. Things like that is to have that return there. So that's the damage buckets, the damage categories of the game. If you found value in the video, leave a like down below, leave a comment. It helps me out tremendously. I love reading them as well. I read every single one of them. And if you have any questions, come hang out with me on my live stream. I'd be happy to answer them there, and I'd be happy to chat with you. So good luck. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.